So I finished talking about David and Abigail last time, and those two are described in chapter 25 in the first book of Samuel. The way that chapter ends is that David gets married to another woman as well. So even though that's not atypical in the Bible, it is one of those topics that is somewhat brushed under the rug, it's swept under the rug, or it is explained incorrectly in the sense that those things were happening before Jesus Christ, and therefore they're not applicable to Christianity. So that leaves a whole lot of questions open, and I would rather discuss this topic than simply brush it under the rug like a lot of preachers, ministers, pastors do nowadays. And I will kind of do a comprehensive review of the topic of polygamy in the Bible and where that leaves us from the point of view of Christianity. So, first of all, David married Michal, then he married Abigail, then he married Ahinoam, and then afterwards he acquired a whole lot of wives until they became countless. This did not start with David. It started way earlier, and I'm going to just go over some of those instances of polygamy in the Bible from the beginning, and then discuss how that is part of Christianity and how we should review that to this day. So, we're introduced to polygamy with Abraham in the book of Genesis. He's got multiple children from different women. Some are wives, some are not wives. And then Isaac sort of is the only one of the patriarchs that sticks to one wife, and that is Rebekah. His sons, their sons, Esau and Jacob, have respectively 2 wives and then 4 wives. And this does not stop with them. Then we go through the book of Judges, and I want to just read you a few of those in the book of Judges so that you can get an idea. Now, once again, just a reminder, the first book of Samuel is the 7th book in the Bible, and that's where we get introduced to David, right? And before that, we have the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. Then we have the book of Judges, and then we have the book of Ruth. So I guess that would be the first book of Samuel would be the 8th book in the Bible. But we see instances of polygamy way before him. So let's take a look at some in the book of Judges. Gideon. And Gideon had 70 sons of his body begotten, for he had many wives. This is in the book of Judges, chapter 8, verse 30. Gideon, by the way, is one of those that later on, after Christ, he is commended for his faith in the book of Hebrews. All right? So further down we have Ibzan, and after him Ibzan of Bethlehem judged Israel, and he had 30 sons and 30 daughters, whom he sent abroad, and took in 30 daughters from abroad for his sons, and he judged Israel 7 years. Then died Ibzan and was buried at Bethlehem. 30 sons, 30 daughters. Now, it's not explicitly stated here that he had many wives, but obviously you cannot have 60 children with one wife. So there's a whole lot of polygamy that is actually implied, but not all of it. Then we get to Abdon, also in the book of Judges. And after him, Abdon, the son of Hallel, Pirathonite, judged Israel, and he had 40 sons and 30 nephews that rode on 70 ass colts, and he judged Israel 8 years. So 70 means 3 times 20, so 60. But again, he had 40 sons and 30 nephews. So apparently he also did not have just one wife. And then after Abdon, we get to Samson. We know the story of Samson and Delilah. Samson also had multiple wives, not necessarily at the same time, which is neither here nor there. There was an overlap for a bit. And then we have David, right? And this is in the 2nd book of Samuel. Now, as far as we know, Ruth was widowed. Boaz, her husband, that's in the book of Ruth, that predates David. Ruth she was widowed, and then she was married to Boaz. Boaz, from what we know, only had one wife. Then we get into the first book of Samuel, and this is where we start with the kings, right? And so here is just a general idea of David. I discussed Michal, I discussed Abigail, I discussed Ahinoam, and then further down in the second book of Samuel, we get to, and unto David were sons born in Hebron, and his firstborn was Amnon of Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and his second Chileab of Abigail, the wife of Nabal the Carmelite, and the third Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur, and the fourth Adonijah, the son of Haggith, and the fifth Shephatiah, the son of Abital, and the sixth Ithream by Eglah, David's wife. These were born to David in Hebron. So David becomes king in Hebron, and then he becomes king over all of Israel in Jerusalem, and this is described in the second book of Samuel, chapter 5. And David took him more concubines and wives out of Jerusalem after he was come from Hebron, and there were yet sons and daughters born to David, and these be the names of those that were born unto him in Jerusalem: Shemua, and Shobab, and Nathan, and Solomon, Ibhar also, and Elishua, and Nepheg, and Japhiah, and Elishama, and Elida, and Eliphalet. Some pretty cool names here. So obviously he had a whole lot of wives and concubines to the point where they're not even numbered. So just simply it says more concubines and wives out of Jerusalem, right? And then we get to his son Solomon. That's the son that he had with Bathsheba, along with Nathan. And this is in the first book of Kings. And he had, so that is Solomon, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart, for it came to pass when Solomon was old that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. All right, so we move on to Rehoboam. That's the son of Solomon, and Rehoboam loved Maacah, the daughter of Absalom, above all his wives and his concubines, for he took 18 wives and 80 concubines, and begat 28 sons and 80 daughters. 80 means 60, so he had 18 wives, 60 concubines, and begat 28 sons and 80 daughters. So 28 sons, and 60 daughters. And then we get further down into the kings. Abijah waxed mighty. But Abijah waxed mighty and married 14 wives and begat 22 sons and 16 daughters. All right, so waxed mighty just simply means he got very powerful, and he married 14 wives and begat 22 sons and 16 daughters. And then further down we have Ahab and Jezebel. We're only told of one of Ahab's wives, that is Jezebel. But Ahab had 70 sons. We know that for a fact. That is 70 sons. We're not told how many daughters he had. Clearly, Jezebel did not have 70 sons. We know for a fact she had one daughter. We don't know much else. So, this is a recurring theme in the Old Testament, so that is before Jesus Christ, right? So it begs the question, did these people live according to different rules, as some pastors or preachers would have you understand? And they just generally refer to the things that Jesus Christ spoke in what is referred to as the New Testament. And I will just kind of quote a little bit of what Christ himself said. Now, of course, if you're a Christian, you believe that Christ is God, so we take his words as the words of God. So this is in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10. But from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. So then there are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder, right? And that is specifically referring to divorce. There's another much greater and lengthier explanation that I will get into in the book of John. But for now, I just want to point out a few things here. So, from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. That's a quote that is often discussed, that God made them man and female from the beginning. However, a lot of people do not notice that it says from the beginning, and I'll go into that a little bit later as well. So the beginning is explained in chapter 1 in the book of Genesis. The problem is that after the beginning, a very dramatic event happens, and after that event, God judges the man and the woman, and then they are no longer subject to immortality. So they are subject to death, right? And the thing about death is that it arrives through various means. It arrives through old age. It can be as a result of violence and murder, as we are told multiple times here. It can also be the result of suicide, as we'll find out about Saul here in just a few chapters, right? But death also could arrive through various diseases. Some are obviously physical, some are obvious, some are not so obvious, some are behavioral diseases, right? So death brings along a lot of diseases, and some of those diseases are reflected clearly in the Bible, right? So it begs the question, did the people before Christ, did they not know the law, right? And that is obviously absurd. Both David and a whole lot of people prior to him and a whole lot of people after him, they not just knew the law, they were well versed in every single book that predated them. Again, David came along in the first book of Samuel. There are 8 books prior to him that were he was clearly well versed in all of them, right? We have records of him quoting out of the book of Genesis. And then we also have records of specifically Joab, his captain of the host, his general of the army, alluding to the fact that he himself, Joab, was very familiar with the book of Judges because he quotes a story out of it to present to David, right? So also there's another thing that is very interesting here, is that whenever Christ himself says that, but from the beginning of the creation God made them male and female, he is not coming up with something new in the Gospel of Mark. That's the first book of the New Testament, right? He's simply quoting from the book of Genesis, and let me just read that for you. So this is in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, verses 23 and 24. And Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." So Jesus Christ in the Gospel of Mark and later on in the Gospel of John, he's just simply quoting in this case, the 2nd chapter of the book of Genesis, and he makes it very clear that this is in the beginning, from the beginning, right? But that's not necessarily what happens afterwards, right? When death is introduced to the world through the judgment of God on those 2 people, whether fair or not, that's not a topic of conversation here, right? Okay. What is interesting here is that the polygamous nature of the relationships in the Old Testament and the polygamous nature of these specifically men, in the cases that I brought up, that is not necessarily judged by God, right? God does not judge these people based on the polygamous nature of their marriages. God judges David specifically for what? He judges him for adultery. So adultery is clearly defined as something other than polygamy, okay? And I will go into that here in a little bit. Solomon is also not judged by God for the fact that he had a relatively large body count there, 1,000, right? 700 wives and 300 concubines. He's judged because those women took his heart away from God, so he was not perfect in his heart like his father David was. So that is eye-opening, first of all. Second of all, there's a whole lot more in the book of John, and I will read that here very slowly because this is a very critical passage in the book of John where Jesus Christ discusses the nature of human relationships between men and women specifically, right? After the beginning. And I want to just read that to you. So first of all, what I'm going to get into is in the first part of the book of John, Jesus Christ encounters a woman, and this is a very interesting story. And this is more along the lines of the script has flipped a little bit, where a woman is not necessarily polygamous, but has been in multiple relationships, right? So this is in the 4th chapter of the book of John. There cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus saith unto her, Give me to drink. For his disciples were gone away unto the city to buy meat. Then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, How is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. Jesus answered and said unto her, If thou knewest the gift of God, and who it is that saith to thee, Give me to drink, thou wouldest have asked me, and he would have given thee living water. The woman saith unto him, Sir, thou hast nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. From whence then hast thou that living water? Art thou greater than our father Jacob, which gave us the well, and drank thereof himself, and his children, and his cattle? Jesus answered and said unto her, Whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again, but whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. The woman saith unto him, Sir, give me this water, that I thirst not, neither come hither to draw. And Jesus saith unto her, Go, call thy husband, and come hither. The woman answered and said, I have no husband. Jesus said unto her, Thou hast well said, I have no husband. For thou hast had 5 husbands, and he whom thou now hast is not thy husband. In that sayest thou truly. The woman saith unto him, Sir, I perceive that thou art a prophet. Right? So this is somewhat of a lengthy story here, and then this story goes on. But what happens here is that Jesus meets this Samaritan woman who is going out in the middle of the day, in the middle of the heat, to draw water. There's the perception that there's some shame that she's out there in the middle of the day when no one else is out there. So she tells him, he tells her, first of all, that I am the one that's going to give you water that you will never thirst from again, right? So he's using allegory here, metaphor, that he is the living well, right? And she says, you have nothing to draw water with, and that well is deep. Are you better than our father Jacob, who gave us this well, right? So this goes back to a story about Jacob giving these people a well in that land, in Samaria, right? And he tells her, go and get your husband, right? So she says, I have no husband. And he calls her out and says, you're absolutely right. You truly do not have a husband. You've had 5 husbands, and the one you're living with right now is not your husband. So imagine meeting the only celebrity you ever want to have dinner with, that is Jesus Christ, and he calls you out on your body count, right? That's precisely what he's doing here, except not really, right? He doesn't really judge her on that either. He just simply indicates that he has the ability that no one else on earth or in heaven has, and that is that he knows absolutely everything. He cannot just read minds, as in the story of Philip and Nathaniel, but he also knows people's past. He knows absolutely everything, right? And that is another indication of his divinity. So he simply uses that not to judge her because she's had 5 husbands and the one she's living with right now is not her husband. He just simply tells her that I know everything. I am greater than your father Jacob, right? That's the entire story. And then he goes on to spend a few days in that town and explains the gospel, in other words, the good news to that town. And then they come to believe and pray to the one who is described as the living water, right? That's the entire idea of the story. Very similar to Solomon and David and all the other ones that preceded them. He's not judging them on the nature of their past relationships or on the polygamous nature of their marriages. He's simply stating the fact, right? Okay, now going back to the idea of how adultery is different from polygamy and why David was judged on his adulterous relationship with Bathsheba, right? Because that is what he was judged on, not on his polygamous nature, not on the polygamous nature of his relationship. So, adultery is defined in at least one spot, and that is in the book of Matthew. It's in chapter 5, verses 27 and 28, and that is the words of God himself, Christ Jesus. Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not commit adultery, but I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. So this one is a hard one for people to grasp conceptually, although they know fully well that you're not just simply walking down the street and you fall on top of someone, try to get up 5 times and then you call that adultery, right? I mean, adultery ultimately has to start somewhere. And what Christ is explaining to us is that starts in the heart or with lust towards another. In this case, specifically called out another woman, right? So a man looks at a woman with lust. So that story precisely matches the story of David and Bathsheba, right? David simply sees her, he lusts after her, and then he physically is with her and gets her pregnant and then murders her husband, right? So that is the definition of adultery. Now, of course, later on in the book of John, chapter 8, we're told of a woman who was caught in the act of adultery. So she was physically caught in the act of adultery. Now imagine that. And then the elders come and they want to tempt him, Christ that is, and they tell him, we're told that we should stone these people. What shall we do? Should we stone her, right? And he draws a line in the sand. That's where that phrase comes from. He draws a line in the sand and then says, whoever is without sin, let him cast the first stone, right? And then they just simply walk away because their guilty conscience simply betrays them, right? And he tells the woman, where are the men that condemn you? She says, they're nowhere to be found. So he says, I do not condemn you either. Go and sin no more, right? So that's the end of that story. So again, we see the nature of God very, very clearly when we are presented with these relationships that have gone awry one way or another, whether it's through polygamy or through adultery or through multiple divorces and husbands and so on, right? So, that's neither here nor there. I think we should probably be a little bit like God himself in that regard. Now, another thing that a whole lot of people apparently miss after they read chapter 1, where in the beginning God created them man and woman and they are made for each other, is that in the 3rd chapter of the book of Genesis, we're told that after the fall, after the man commits sin and the couple is judged, that the relationship between men and women is no longer going to be perfect. It's going to be a struggle. That is literally in the 3rd, I believe it's the 3rd, it's definitely in the 3rd chapter of Genesis. I believe it's, verse 8. Either way, it's very clear that after God pronounces judgment on the man and the woman, the relationship between men and women going forward has broken down. It's no longer that perfection that it was in the beginning, right? So that begs the question then, how should we behave in this world as Christians, right? What is the guiding line, right? There is a very clear answer to that, and both Christ and later on Paul comment extensively on that. So I'm going to once again slowly read what Jesus Christ himself says in the book of Matthew, and that is in chapter 19, verses 1 through 12. And I will go over and explain that because some of the phrases used here are a little bit outdated. Some of the diction is a little bit outdated, but here's how it goes. And it came to pass that when Jesus had finished these sayings, he departed from Galilee and came into the coasts of Judea beyond Jordan. And great multitudes followed him, and he healed them there. The Pharisees also came unto him, tempting him, and saying unto him, Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? Put away here simply means divorce, right? And he answered and said unto them, Have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, For this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain, two, shall be one flesh. Wherefore there are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. They said unto him, that is the Pharisees, they said unto him, Why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement and to put her away? He, Christ that is, he saith unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery, and whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery. His disciples say unto him, If the case of the man be so with his wife, it is not good to marry. But he said unto them, All men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. For there are some eunuchs which were so born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men, and there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. So this is a critical passage in the book of Matthew. And I want to go over this one right here. So first of all, this is the issue of divorce, right? So the Pharisees are saying, why did Moses allow and give the law from God of divorcement, right, if it was not so in the beginning? And Christ clearly tells them, first of all, twice in the beginning it was so, and then he goes on to say, because of the hardness of your hearts suffered you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it was not so, right? So he's saying, because of your nature, the hardness of your hearts, he gave you the law of divorcement, but from the beginning it was not so. And then he goes on to explain that ultimately that is also considered adultery, right? And that is, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication. And I discussed fornication a while back. I'm not going to go into this, but this does not mean that it is sex outside of marriage or sexual immorality is what the translations currently are. Sexual immorality, that's got nothing to do with that. It's got to do with keeping covenants between people and between people and God. What's very interesting here is what follows as his disciples say unto him, If the case of the man be so with his wife, it is not good to marry. So they're obviously panicking a little bit here. They're saying, well, hang on a second. If we cannot divorce our wives, then maybe we should just simply not marry, right? I mean, this is a very obvious conclusion for some people that are, imagine that 2,000 years ago, people had those concerns. If I cannot divorce, I'm just not going to get married, right? And what is he saying? All men cannot receive this saying. So he's saying not everyone can accept that. In other words, not everyone is created like that. So a eunuch is someone that, in the word eunuch today, is defined as those who were made eunuchs of men. In other words, they were incapacitated by men. He's using the word eunuch here in a very general term of people who remain unmarried or remain single. So he's saying all men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. So only some people remain single. For there are some eunuchs which were so born from their mother's womb. In other words, some people were incapacitated, incapable, in other words, of consummating a marriage, if you will, or have no desire to be with a partner in life. They were made so from their mother's womb. They were born like that, right? This is another consequence of the fact that we don't live in immortality or perfection anymore. We don't live in the beginning anymore, right? There are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men. In other words, they were one way or another incapacitated, and therefore they have no desire to be with a partner. And then there are those which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. So in other words, they remain single because their focus is on God, and I will touch on that later on because Paul very much echoes that comment, and it is a brilliant dissertation of how we should treat relationships and what we should do in life, rather than what a whole lot of people out there tell us, right? The perfect Christian is going to get married and have a bunch of kids and just one wife, right? That is not ever stated in this book. I have no idea where it comes from. And then he finishes that by saying, he that is able to receive it, let him receive it. He that is able to receive that saying, all right? He that is able to receive that saying. In other words, he that is able to remain single, let him remain single, right? So what God is describing here is a very typical description of the gamma of the spectrum of relationships and lack of relationships we see in real life, right? This is clearly a very observable reality. Some people simply cannot stay single, right? They also cannot stay in one relationship as the woman that we described above, right? They go from relationship to relationships unto the end. So, in other words, the vast majority of people cannot receive that saying. The vast majority of people simply cannot remain single, right? They cannot. They go from relationship to relationship. And in the case of the people that predated Christ, especially the wealthy ones, for some reason the kings that had a whole lot of disposable income, so to speak, they had polygamous marriages, right? They were married to many women, countless in some case, in others 1,000, right? So this simply describes the entire spectrum of relationships or lack thereof in the world that we observe today, because it is no different today than it was back then. Just because today we have, or you live in a country that just a random country and random point in history that does not allow polygamous marriages, right? That doesn't mean it just simply doesn't happen physically. It happens all the time. They call it hookup culture. They call it, I don't know what, ethical monogamy and some other words that are used today to describe relationships that are by nature polygamous. Just because there is no paper that confirms that from a jurisdiction in a country, that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, right? So he's just simply explaining the reality that exists without any judgment. He's saying this is how it is, period, right? Very typical of God's nature and his, in this case, lack of judgment, going backwards thousands of years, including during his time, right? Okay. What does Paul say about the matter? Because Paul also has a whole lot of writings on that matter that very much echo what Christ himself says. So let me read you a couple of those. So this is in the first book of Corinthians. Now concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me, so he's addressing this church in Corinth, it's a town out there in, I guess, what is present-day Turkey. It is good for a man not to touch a woman, nevertheless to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife had not power over her own body, but the husband. And likewise also the husband had not power of his own body, but the wife. Defraud ye not one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinence. But I speak this by permission and not of commandment, for I would that all men were even as I myself. But every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that. Very much echoes what Jesus Christ says in the Gospels, right? So he's saying it's good for a man not to touch a woman, nevertheless, to avoid fornication, once again, to avoid breaking covenants between man and God. Let every man have his wife. So he's simply saying, and I want you to focus on the fact that he's saying, but I speak this by permission and not of commandment. So he's saying it's good for a man to have a wife. However, I would that all men were even as I myself. So he's saying, I would rather all men be like me. He was single, right? He didn't have a wife. Once again, he's the one that is a eunuch because of the kingdom of heaven, right? That was his focus, and we'll hear a little bit more about that here in just a second. But every man hath his proper gift of God, and one after this manner, and another after that. So once again, according to Paul, just as according to Jesus Christ, there are no hard and fast rules for people on earth. Some have their own gift, others do not. Some can remain single and focus on the kingdom of heaven. Others simply cannot do it, right? So he does not in any way contradict Jesus Christ here, nor does he judge. And also he's very clear in one of the very few instances in the Bible, if I'm not mistaken, this may be the only instance that I know of, where he's saying, I speak by permission. So this is my advice to you. It's not a commandment. Permission, not commandment. Permission, not commandment. Huge difference, right? He's saying, I would rather you be like me. And we'll find out why he's saying, I would rather you be like me, right? So here's where it comes in once again, just a few chapters. It's the following verses, right? I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I, right? So he's saying for those who are unmarried and widows, abide as I, meaning be single, remain that. But if they cannot contain, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn. I don't know what burn means here, but that critically and accurately explains those people who simply cannot remain single, right? If they cannot contain, let them marry. No big deal. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. But, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. And let not the husband put away his wife, but to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath a husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? And how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? Right? So I'll explain a little bit of this one. Once again, no hard and fast rules. There is absolutely nothing that is strict about relationships. What he's saying is to the unmarried and the widows, just if you can, remain, but if you cannot, get married again, no big deal. On the married ones, he's saying, do not deprive yourself, right? Do not defraud yourself. I love that 17th century English here. So he's saying, unless you dedicate time by consent to fasting and prayer, right? So this is definitely a very interesting comment. Fasting, I can tell you, science will tell you, And I can tell you personally that it kills a whole lot of desires, okay? It kills a whole lot of desires when it comes to the opposite sex, Or not, I suspect. But that's neither here nor there. It's a very accurate scientific description of the fact that fasting will actually kill some desire. And he's saying, unless you dedicate time to fasting and prayer, do not deprive yourselves, because then you may be tempted, right? And that temptation, I assume, is talking about adultery here, right? And then he's also saying, if a woman is a believer and she's pleased to live with her husband, do not depart from him, and vice versa, right? How do you know that you're not gonna, he's using the word save them, right? So don't put her away. All right. And then one last one. This is a good one too. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord. Yet I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful, right? So once again, Paul is explicitly stating that he's got no commandment. I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man so to be. Art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. But, and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. This is another good one. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. This harkens back to the beginning, chapter 3, after the beginning, in the book of Genesis, that he's saying that there's going to be trouble in the relationships that you get into, period. But this I say, brethren, that time is short. It remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they had none, and they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoiced not, and they that buy as though they possessed not, and they that use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away. But I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. There is difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I speak for your own profit, for your own benefit. Not that I may cast a snare upon you, but for that which is comely, and that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction, right? So if there are any hard and fast rules here, is that what he's saying is that if you get into a relationship, you will run into trouble. If anyone's been in a relationship, you may have encountered that. If not, good for you. So what he's saying, it is best to remain like him, but again, there are no hard and fast rules. If you're married, you might as well pretend like you're not married and take care of the things of the Lord, because the time is now, right? That's his idea here from a Christian perspective, of course. Nothing to do with the secular world. Ultimately, he does not reject anything that Christ spoke of. He simply repeats the same things. If you're married, remain married. Ultimately, it is you're going to take care of the kingdom of heaven if you remain. In this case, he's using the word virgin. If you get married, you're going to care about the well-being of your spouse. So therefore, you're going to care about the things of the world, right? So that's precisely what Jesus Christ said previously. That, first of all, right, not everyone can accept that saying, but some people remain single for the kingdom of heaven's sake, right? That ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction. Once again, the internal consistency is incredible. Whether you believe in the book or not, I'm simply trying to present the internal consistency of this book. It is internally consistent from the beginning to the end. It's just that some people skip parts of it, is what is referred to as cherry picking, right, verses of the Bible. So, what are, in conclusion, because this is a very complex topic, and of course, it has been perverted just like a whole lot of Christianity. It is a difficult topic that requires precision when discussing that, and it requires for people to just truly understand what God's intention is for human beings, right? So, God did create man and woman from the beginning, which we do not live in anymore, and they were created for each other. Again, we're no longer in that beginning because death was introduced. That was the judgment of God on these people, and then we end up in a world where death defines a whole lot. It defines relationships. It defines how people live their lives. So there are behavioral disorders, I don't know how else to phrase it, that push people into relationships, and especially in polygamous relationships, that cause a lot of harm. Now, it was not explicitly denounced. Polygamy was not explicitly denounced. However, every single story about polygamy in the Bible ends up in a heap of trouble, right? Starting with Abraham, so much conflict, then going through Jacob. He was worn out by his 4 wives, and I'm not talking about physical worn out here, which potentially that was the case as well, right? And then we move on to David. His relationships with the various women caused a whole lot of harm, not just on him, but on society. He was judged harshly by God because he was given a lot, right? When you've been given power, you're held responsible. And David was held responsible to an unimaginable extent, right? Solomon, the same thing, his son, right? 1,000 women in his case. And then he was judged not because of the polygamy. He was judged because they veered his heart away from God, right? So marriage is not some sort of a traditional Christian outcome for Christians. That is ridiculous. I have no idea where these trad relationships and all that stuff comes from. If you want to really serve the kingdom of heaven, if you want to really serve God, then remain single, right? Otherwise, you're serving someone else. I mean, that is explicitly stated multiple times. Yet, once again, we have people who preach that, and I do not understand where it comes from. Maybe it comes from a different book that was written centuries later, but not from the Bible, right? The other conclusion here is that a whole lot of people simply cannot remain single. That is explained multiple times to us. It's just not something that they've been given as a gift, period, right? They go from relationship to another relationship and so on until they get widowed. I don't know what the outcome is. Very few notebook scenarios there where you die holding hands with someone in old age. So death, of course, does separate us, especially in the case of couples. So polygamy appears to be based on implied, indirect stories. Polygamy appears to be some sort of I don't know. I have some few notes here, but it appears to be some sort of a short-term solution to problems. You know, these people have problems, otherwise they wouldn't do what they did, right? I mean, David knew better. He knows what adultery is. He just couldn't help himself, right? I mean, he's got problems, man. He had problems, right? And we'll find out that later with more wives and problematic children that comes from those relationships, not because he was a bad father. I would never advertise that. I don't think that's the case. Just simply these relationships brought a whole lot of problems on him. So unlike money, where the relationships between more money and more problems is not linear, the relationships between more wives or husbands and more problems is very much linear, right? So what about from a secular standpoint, something that is outside of the Bible, right? Outside of the Bible, first of all, I would hope people that are just interested in this do not get confused by what some people say. I think I did a relatively thorough job of going about what God himself thinks on the matter, and whether he judges people or not based on the nature of their relationships or their body count or whatever it is, right? Polygamy generally in a secular society is not a good thing, right? And that is, there's a whole lot of secular research on that. monogamous relationships in a society are what creates a healthy society, simply because it could be also good for business, right? It creates a population growth, but also it's good for soldiers and so on and so on. It also creates less conflict in society, right? A whole lot of single men is a well-known fact for a whole lot of disturbance in society, right? Specifically single men. So from a secular standpoint, the secular research does not disagree with the Bible. It tells you that there are a spectrum of relationships out there. Ultimately, a monogamous society is a healthier society. But as we can tell, polygamy is alive and well today, just like it was 4,000 years ago, just like it was 3,000 years ago, just like it was 2,000 years ago, just like was 1,000 years ago, according to the Bible, right? There's a whole lot of research to support that it was not just according to the Bible, right? So, ultimately, all scenarios are clearly described in the Bible, and what is probably important for us to understand is that God himself does not judge people based on the nature of their relationships. He judges people on other things, but not that. And again, like I said, I would hate to face the judgment of God, so I try to abide by that principle. It also makes my life easier. I mean, it's a waste of my time and energy to judge people for anything like that. And we should focus more on his true commandments and not some made up commandments by people, right, that live in the society that we live in. So, not to sound fatalistic here, but may God help you all navigate through this, and I will see you next time.